In this lesson, we will use the update method on the Hibernate API to reattach a detached entity to a persistence context. We're going to head to our database and we're going to execute our populate script, and then we'll just make sure that all of our banks have been inserted into the database. So we have these 4 bank records. We'll be working with one of those during our example. Looking at what we have, we create a session, so that's creating a new persistence context, and then we load a bank entity into the persistence context. So now it has a persistent state. And then we close our session, also closing the persistence context. At this point, our bank entity is detached. It is not attached to any persistence context. We then create a new session, creating another persistence context. Within this new transaction for this persistence context, we're going to work with our bank entity and we're going to reattach it to our second session. Just to demonstrate, I'm going to point out that the bank entity is currently not contained within our second session or persistence context. And then what we're going to do is call the update method on the second session, and we're going to pass in the bank entity. And this will cause that entity to be reattached to the persistence context, causing it to go from a detached state to a persistent state. So I'm just going to print out that we have invoked our method, and then we're also going to see whether that entity is now attached. What I'm also going to do is set one of the fields on the bank entity after we have reattached it. So I'll set the name of the bank to test bank. What will happen is Hibernate just automatically assumes that when we reattach an entity, that it has been dirtied. So in other words, that one of its fields have been set. Hibernate will always perform an update statement when we invoke the update operation to reattach a detached entity to a session. So let's see this in action. We issue our select statement to retrieve the entity during our first session, and then we check to see whether or not that entity is attached to our second session. We see that in line 29, and we get a printout of false, so we know it's not attached at that point. Then we see that we have invoked our update method. And once we check to see whether it's attached now, we get a true response, meaning it is attached. And then finally, when we commit our transaction, Hibernate will sync our entity model and our database, issuing that update statement that we've talked about. So this example showed you how to reattach a detached entity to a persistence context. An update statement is subsequently fired to the database to ensure that if the entity were dirtied, meaning it has a different state or some of the fields have been changed, the database is synced with that new state.